Hey, everybody. Want to talk a little bit about how people reacted to and responded to the Industrial Revolution now that we have a good understanding of the background of the first Industrial Revolution. So, today we're going to discuss responses, social responses, political responses to the Industrial Revolution, and how that altered and changed people's lives, not only in Europe, but around the world. So, before we begin, it's important that you understand that there wasn't, unlike a lot of the experiences from the urban game, it wasn't all negative. There were some positive experiences or positive effects of the Industrial Revolution. And just like I said, despite these problems that we experienced, it did create jobs for workers. It contributed to a growing wealth in many different nations. It also fostered technological progress and invention, and it created increased productions of goods and services and raised the standard of living for many people. And it led to an emergent middle class in some of these Western democratic nations of Europe. So it's important to understand, yes, that there were some negative uh, aspects to the Industrial Revolution, child labor and working conditions, and the disruption of the family life, and all of the different negative things that were highlighted in the urban game, and those were real, historical problems that people had to grapple with and deal with, and it did alter the dynamic of the social fabric of Europe and many other nations around the world. But just like with any historical development, there are positive as well as negative impacts of it. So I do want to highlight that it wasn't all negative, and that industry and growing global capitalism did offer some other benefits. There were better, healthier diets, better housing, cheaper mass-produced clothing, and it created a demand for different professions like engineers and clerical and professional workers. It expanded educational opportunities for more and more people, and the middle and upper classes prospered, obviously immediately from the Industrial Revolution. And for the workers, it took longer, but over time, their lives gradually improved during the 1800s, and they eventually win, higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions. We'll talk about that today, about how they joined together, they formed labor unions, and they worked for these better conditions. And then finally, for governments, the Industrial Revolution produced tax revenues that were, not there before, and those funds or those tax revenues allowed local, state, and federal governments to invest in urban improvements and raise the standard of living for most city dwellers. Uh, Nevertheless, there were problems, and it took a while for workers to achieve those better working conditions and for governments to address the needs of workers. So that's what we're going to look at today. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit. By the way, first of all, you need to understand that what we experienced during the urban game and the video you just watched about the Industrial Revolution, that was the first Industrial Revolution. And so it's important to know that the first industrial revolution was the revolution that dealt with textile manufacturing and the steam engine and steam powered, the railroad, and James Watt's invention and all of those things. The second industrial revolution, there was another wave of industrial improvements or technological advances called the second industrial revolution, and that's generally a time period from the mid 19th century through World War One, or as it says here on the side, 1840s to about 1914. And this was a revolution in new fields or new technological advances in steel, in gas engines, combustible engines that used fossil fuels to produce power as opposed to just coal and steam. There are advances in replacing gas lighting with electrical wiring and electrical lighting. This was all part of the second industrial revolution. Advances in chemicals, assembly lines with precision machinery, mass production. Henry Ford's Model T and the mass production of automobiles and other things. That's all part of the second industrial revolution. Now, there is a third, just as a kind of a side here, there's a third industrial revolution that occurred in the 20th century during my lifetime, all the way up to kind of the present day, and that's the revolution in communications, or the digital revolution, as they say, with computing and the internet and cell phones, and that has really, of course, revolutionized the economies around the world. Now, some sociologists and some historians are saying we're actually beginning a fourth industrial revolution, which I think is kind of interesting, which is kind of the age of AI, of artificial intelligence, of self-driving cars, of using DNA information for health benefits and for treatments, robotic technologies, 3D printing, all of those kinds of things. So it's kind of an exciting time to be alive during this fourth industrial revolution. All right, so let's go back in time a little bit. As I said, there were some issues, there were some problems with the lives of workers, and the squalor and problems of rapid, massive urbanization that was taking place at the beginning of the 19th century, and on into the 1800s, and so there were challenges, there were problems, there was pollution, crime, overcrowding, long work hours. There were no protections or safeguards for workers in factories. There were a lot of different problems that needed to be addressed, and that was something that we start to see happening during the 1800s. If you go back even further, it's important to understand who this guy was, Adam Smith. Adam Smith was one of these early Enlightenment thinkers. He was one of these philosophes that you encountered in the museum activity, perhaps. And going back to the late 1700s, 1776, he writes this book called The Wealth of Nations. And in it, he is very critical of the 16th century economic systems of Europe, called mercantilism. If you recall, mercantilism was this idea that government should control trade, that they should use their colonies to benefit themselves, that you wanted to export more than you import, and that the governments took a very hands-on approach to controlling the economics, or the trade systems of their country. Well, Adam Smith said, no, this is limiting the economic growth. This government should stay out of the affairs of trade. They should allow free trade, to prosper, to grow, and then it'll exponentially grow and will benefit the state. When you try to limit who can sell what to who and what markets are available to certain groups, then you kind of stifle that growth and that innovation. And so his kind of this enlightenment thought was that you leave the economy alone. It's a laissez-faire, which it says here. Laissez-faire means, it's French for hands off, right? Leave it alone. And he would have argued, or he does argue in his book, he said, what you want to do is you want to let the supply and demand of the economy determine what is needed, what people should invest in, and how much they should set their prices, and all of those capitalist ideas. He is known as the father of modern capitalism because of this book, and he argues that the market will determine. It'll let you set price, and it'll let you determine when there needs to be more investment in a particular industry or field. So he called that the invisible hand. And what the invisible hand did was it basically set price. So just to give you an example, if you set up a lemonade stand and you wanted to sell a cup of lemonade for, say, $10 a cup, you probably wouldn't sell very much because that's a little bit excessive. People aren't going to pay $10 for a cup of lemonade. But if you set the price too low, let's say you just set it at a penny, people are going to buy it, but you're not going to make a profit. You're not going to make enough money to cover the cost of your supplies. And so you won't be in business very long, right? And so that was what he said. You got to let the market determine how much you should sell your cup of lemonade for. You want to stay in business, you want to make a profit, but you don't want to charge too much. And so he said that there's this internal pressure called the invisible hand that would determine that, and that governments needed to stay out of it and let the market determine supply and demand. And so that was kind of a revolutionary idea back in the 1700s. It kind of went against the ideas of mercantilism from the 1600s. Now, of course, are you going to just let um, you know, unfettered capitalism run amok and not have any government protections or controls at all in the economy? That was something that in the 1800s, governments and thinkers and philosophers and economists start grappling with. Was like, how do we how do we address some of these political, social problems that are arising now because of the new revolution in industry, because of this new economic system that's developed? And so you've got other people starting to conceive of new roles for government, looking after the welfare of the people. And so that all begins to start happening in the mid 19th century. Listen to this real quick.
Saw in our episodes about industrialization that in France, a group of aristocrats calling themselves socialists wanted to better society due to a belief that the late 18th century revolutionary era had focused too much on the individual and should focus more on the health of the whole. Their socialism entailed philanthropy, but by the 1820s, a new group of socialists, especially prominent in England and France, had a different take on the issues of the day. In Britain, Robert Owen, who had made his fortune in textiles, inspired the creation of utopian communities. In these communities, factory hands would work a limited number of hours and have benefits, including education, and profit was to take a backseat to the overall well-being of the community and all its individual members. Owen's ideas gained traction among reform-minded industrialists and officials and workers and thinkers, especially since industrialization, with its child labor and incredibly high rates of maiming and workplace death, was rather dystopian. Similarly, in France during the post-Napoleonic period, Claude-Henri Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Auguste Comte devised ideas for well-run communities that emphasized harmony and efficient management. One common idea at the time was the belief in the rational organization of human societies, like engineers and planners often featured prominently in utopian ideas as their skills would make society operate without tensions and uprisings. That is, operate like a well-designed machine. And these thinkers' socialism contributed to the formation of the modern social sciences: sociology, economics, anthropology, and government. Around the world, people also set up phalansteries, the name of communities based on Fourier's writings, organized around the personality characteristics he outlined. Now, although German lawyer and theorist Karl Marx would scorn these ideas and the communities based on them, they also did help pave the way for the socialism to come. Now, God knows we're going to talk more about Marx. What's that, Stan? Oh, Stan informs me that I can't talk about Marx and God knowing anything because to Marx, religion was the opiate of the masses. But we will talk more about Marx and his definition of socialism in our next episode. Then and now, socialism had many meanings, and its definition was ever evolving. The same could be said of the word liberal, which was also evolving from a 17th century belief in basic liberties at birth to the idea of free trade in the 18th century to the concern with accessibility to suffrage and rights in the 19th and 20th. But for now, I just want to note that as people became better educated and were exposed to ideas of individual rights and popular participation in government, it became really difficult for the powerful to hold on to that power without popular support. Your education, and mine, is similarly an opportunity to be exposed to many different ideas so that we might be productive and critical and thoughtful contributors to political and social discourse, as well as contributing to the economy. Education, in a way, is insurance against losing rights and insurance against losing the opportunity to participate in your governance. It's no coincidence that absolutist governments often deny lots of people access to lots of information. But just as the people of early 19th century Europe were shaped by the voices they listened to and the ideas they encountered, we are also shaped by those voices. So we must listen carefully. And as my friend Amy Krauss Rosenthal once wrote, pay attention to what you pay attention to. Thanks for being here.
Okay, so it's important to understand that factory workers did face, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they did face long, long hours in dirty and dangerous working conditions, as we experienced in the urban game. They also faced the threat of being laid off. They were at the mercy of capitalists. They were at the mercy of factory owners. And there were very few protections, if any, for working conditions or for worker safety or worker insurance and those kinds of things. And so to press for reforms, workers used the one thing that they had, which was their ability to unite and organize together and threaten management or threaten the ownership with the threat of, hey, we're going to all stop working at the same time. And that's going to cause a shutdown in your factory. You're not going to make any more profit. And so they use that threat of striking, and they join together in these voluntary labor associations called unions to argue for better working conditions. And there was this whole movement of, for work, for rest, for what we will, that begins in the early 19th century, where they argued you needed 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours for relaxation, right? And so in a 24-hour day or rest, a 24-hour day, you need to have at least, some balance there. And that was something that was achieved. That was something that was granted to these workers because of their efforts and their ability to unionize. And so a union was an association that spoke for all of the workers in a particular trade. There might be a textile factory union. There might be a coal worker union. There might be an electrical, um, you know, a union or whatever. Workers that all did the kind of the same thing would form together in these collective bargaining, negotiating unions, and they would negotiate with their employers and bargain for better working conditions and higher pay. And as I said, if the factory owners refused the demands or the reforms, union members had the ability to strike or refuse to work. And that's, by the way, still around today. And just Google into the news, strike or union, and see what kind of unions are, fighting against what kind of organizations or businesses. Now, in the video, John Green talked a little bit about socialism. He talked about utopian socialism. These early French reformers, such as Fourier and Saint-Simon and others, they try to offset the ill effects of industrialization, with this new economic system called socialism. And then so, in socialism, and this is a word that gets thrown around quite a bit in modern society. What is socialism? What isn't socialism? And so in socialism, the factors of production are somehow owned by the public, or there's some kind of government ownership in business, either through, you know, investments or control, or some kind of, the state basically has a hand in, the free market providing something to the people, right? And they operate it for the welfare benefit of all. And in a purely capitalist system, that would not happen, right? Capitalism is that, private industry is owned by individuals or businesses, and there's no kind of government interference in the business, right? And so capitalists believe, a pure capitalist would believe, that government should just basically, just like Adam Smith argued, leave the day-to-day affairs and the running and the operation and the money and everything to private industry, to the business. But in this new era, in this new context, there were people calling, these utopian socialists were calling for governments to kind of step in, and kind of make sure that capitalism was not, there was some kind of promotion of equality and fairness, and the ending of poverty, which really isn't really kind of in the purview or the concern of a capitalist, right? main motive is the profit motive. And so you've got all of these, dividing priorities between what's best for the workers and what's best for the economy, what's best for business. And so that whole tension is still around today, by the way. I mean, you could argue that there are socialist components to our economy today. And you could argue that capitalism is the best thing to advance the economy and benefit the most people. When you have a growing economy, you have more jobs, and the government should stay out of it. So there's always that tension there between capitalists and socialists. And just like John Green said, there's a lot of different definitions for socialism, but I highlighted three things here. Basically, when the state or the government or whatever, the locality, the township, the community somehow has a hand in business. There are some socialist aspects to that. Now, there were these two guys in the 1840s that wrote this, kind of this monumental work, this revolutionary work called Communist Manifesto. Communism was an even more radical form of utopian socialism, where Karl Marx and his friend Friedrich Engels, these German guys. Friedrich Engels was this. I don't know if I have a picture of him. Was this? He was the son of a textile mill owner, and Karl Marx is this journalist, this writer, and they get together and they're starting to see all the ill effects of the Industrial Revolution and how workers in these textile mills in Manchester and other parts of Europe are suffering. And so they write this pamphlet, this 23-page pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. And basically, in their manifesto, whoops, let me go back. In their manifesto, they're arguing that, you know, human societies have always been divided into warring classes. Now, in their own time, these were the middle class, the haves or employers, the bourgeoisie, et cetera, the capitalists, and the have-nots or the workers, which Marx and Engels called the proletariat. And while the wealthy controlled the means of producing goods, the poor were performing the backbreaking labor under terrible conditions. And according to Marx and Engels, the Industrial Revolution had enriched the wealthy and impoverished the poor. And the two writers predicted that what's eventually going to happen is that the workers are going to get so tired of this, they're going to eventually overthrow the owners, and they're going to take the means of production and control of their own, you know, destinies, their own economic and social destinies themselves. And in the Communist Manifesto, Marx writes famously, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains, and they have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite," right? So Marx believes the capitalist system, which produced the Industrial Revolution, would eventually destroy itself in the following way. Factories would drive small, you know, artisans out of business, leaving a small number of manufacturers to control all the wealth. The large proletariat would revolt, seize the factories and mills from the capitalists, and produce what society needed. Workers sharing in the profit would bring about economic equality for all people, and the workers would control government. He called this the dictatorship of the proletariat. And after a period of cooperative living and education, the state or the government would be unnecessary. It would wither away as a classless society developed. Now, this is all theoretical. This is all, wouldn't it be great if everyone was equal? And Marx called this phase of social evolution pure communism or communal control, complete socialism, where the means of production, all the landmines, factories, railroads, businesses would be owned by the people, and private property, in effect, would cease to exist. All basically in a communist system, a complete equality and fairness, according to Marx, all goods and services would be shared equally. And so, there's this, he publishes this in 1848, which is coincidentally also a time when there's these massive revolutions that are taking place across Europe. So let's listen to this real quick.
A new socialist duo, German lawyer and journalist Karl Marx and Manchester textile mill owner Friedrich Engels, issued the Communist Manifesto. Its famous opening, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism," used the word communism instead of socialism, based on the idea that society would soon revert to a traditional community of like-minded people. Marx and Engels believed that class struggle was going to erupt and wash away upper-class oppression, and that the proletariat would seize the means of production. That is, factories and land and everything else would be shared by everyone rather than owned by the few. And for the moment, that was pretty much it for Marxist socialism, but over the next half-century, it would of course take a firmer theoretical shape and then infuse workers' programs for change across the globe and become tremendously influential. And while initially few people paid attention to the Marxist ideas of class struggle, some kind of struggle was certainly happening. The revolutions erupting across Central and Eastern Europe featured, depending on who you were, calls for the creation of constitutionally directed government structures, an end to serf-like oppression and censorship, restoration of aristocratic privileges, and yes, even democracy.
Okay, so to wrap this up, the ideas of Marx, they're happening at the end of the first industrial revolution. You know, nothing really comes of Marx's Communist Manifesto initially in the first few decades after its publishing, but it's of course going to have huge ramifications later on in the 20th century when we have all of these states and governments adopt Marxist ideologies and Marxist ideas as a way to lift up peasants and lift up oppressed classes and gain power for themselves. So stay tuned for our next unit on that. I did have a picture of Friedrich Engels. They both have extremely strong beard games, as you can see. Karl Marx and remember, Karl Marx is not a Russian, right? He's a German. Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx are Germans in the mid 1800s. It's not until the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution in the old Russian Empire, the new Soviet Union, that Marxism really takes off. I don't know if you know this about me, but if you actually look at my ancestry, I actually did a little bit of research, and even though Marx is from Germany here, because of my northwestern European background, there is a distant relative. My great 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 uncle was Jeffrey Marx, and here you can see him in this very legitimate a realistic photograph of my distant relative. But I just thought that was interesting to share with you. All right, I hope you guys are doing well. I will see you soon.